It was at Yale. There were 15 of us in Rudolph's class, small master's class. And I don't know why, but Norman and I were standing very near each other because nobody knew each other in the class. And I asked Norman, what do you think of Frank Lloyd Wright? And he said something like, I really admire Wright's work. I've only seen it in books. And he seems like maybe he isn't in this century. Norman was on, I think it was a Fulbright scholarship at Yale, and he lived in a dorm very near the architecture building, and I lived in what was a part of a housing redevelopment area above an art shop, and we were about equal distance from the school. So we wound up eating together almost every night, right almost from the beginning. So that was our introduction, and then semester break, Norman, Richard, and Sue, Richard's wife, and I went to see Wright's work in the snow for like 6 days, 8 days, whatever, in my VW Bug, driving from New Haven. When we went through Chicago, it was both Norman and Richard, but I think Norman was probably the instigator of this. My VW Bug had a sky window, and it was freezing. It was more than freezing. And they insisted we open, Norman I know was insisting, because he was, you know, I think I was driving part of this, because he had to look at Chicago, standing, you know, with your head out in the freezing weather of a VW, going through a throughway, looking at Chicago as you're approaching the city. And I don't know if you know, and I don't even know what it is now, but you used to have all these huge oil derricks and tanks all around Chicago as you came to the city. And they were pretty overwhelmed by those. And I thought it was pretty great, but I didn't think it wasn't quite as overwhelmed as they were. Rudolph totally overwhelmed all of us. He gave us things to do that you couldn't do. Rudolph had this reputation of throwing students out of Yale. None of us had met each other. None of us knew Rudolph. So it was like being truly in a firing squad. But he said this, he said, I'm a very prejudiced architect. When I work with you as a professor, I will try to put my prejudices away and try to judge your architecture on what you're doing. And he really did that. He really did that. Vincent Scully had a huge impact on our class, huge. Those were the two strongest, with no question. And just go to his apartment, have beer, or go out and have beer and talk about architecture in the world. The movies, not just architecture. And we did. And Rudolph is not that kind of a person, but Scully was. But one of the things that I think is extremely important to know about our education, Norman and mine specifically, is that it was a small class. There were 15 people, like I said. But that's important, because it was really a one-on-one that Rudolph did. Robert Stern, who was at Yale and he was dean for a number of years, talks about our class, the 61-62 Rudolph year, as being the most dazzling of all the Rudolph years. And I think it was a combination of Norman and me and Richard and Sue, because we were like the leaders as a group of our class, without any question. There was that. I had never been to Europe, and then Norman kept sending me postcards, and Sue, Richard's wife, kept sending me postcards that they were going to open an office in London and come join them. So I did. It's the intensity of working that truly came from Rudolph. I've heard Norman say that he runs his office like Yale. When I was in Team 4, it was like Yale. We worked at all kind of bizarre hours. We would come in the middle of the night, we'd do stuff, and you know, it was like, and both Sue and Richard's family treated me like family. One of the early projects was the Creek Vean project that I was very involved in, and then the small little Marcus's observatory, the bunker. And Norman was so insistent about getting someone who had worked on airplanes to help, because the hinges were the panels were on a diagonal, which nobody could do the hinges. And Norman kept saying, we've got to get an airplane engineer or someone to help us with the doors. And this was not a limitless budget. So it was like, you know, okay, and it was about as big as this. You know, it's tiny. I have a real difficult time calling Norman an architect, only an architect. Norman's a futurist. I don't know the right word. He's a great architect, but he has also taken another level. And his love of Bucky Fuller, and Fuller's work, and Fuller's image, and Fuller's futuristic potential, Norman's tapped into like no one ever. And I had seen, he was a big thing about 5 years before Norman visited us in Florida, was the geodesic dome. And I said, and there was a sign somewhere, we were looking at buildings in Sarasota, again, 49 something years ago with Wendy and Norman. There was a sign that Bucky Fuller was going to be in Sarasota, making a lecture. He talked about wind energy, talked about, sun energy, which was not new, but relatively new. And he was amazing. And Norman knew this, and he tapped into a lot of this. And so I think there's a lot of other things too that make Norman, but certainly Bucky Fuller is a key part of his vision. I think that it's human nature to appreciate people who are like a generation beyond you, before you. I think Norman will be appreciated more by young architectural students than those of his peers. To me, Norman's big focus is this world. It's to make our world last and better. And I think the thing of being an architect is almost, I don't want to say secondary, but it's not, to me, of Norman's work, it's not as important as what his visions are. I know Norman, and I feel that I know where his heart and his whole spirit is. I mean, he really wants to help save the world, So it's like, and architects, futurists have that potential. I think most of us architects feel that we don't have the energy or the resources or the whatever to actually make this happen, to get into this super architecture, as it were. And Norman's been able to make these things happen in an amazing way.